In the first slide set, we talked about what is a GMO, or a genetically engineered um, or genetically modified organism. But primarily, we talked about the different techniques used for making a GMO and the different technologies involved. And this time, in this slide set, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the actual traits involved. So here are a couple questions we've had. What crops have a GMO trait? What do the traits do? And who benefits from those traits? And a related question, why are all the GMO traits aimed at increasing production rather than adding value to nutrition of foods or other health benefits? So we'll explore that as we go through this slide set. So there are various GMO traits, or genetically engineered crop traits. They would include herbicide tolerance, insect tolerance, improved nutrition, disease resistance, stress tolerance, increased storage, medicinal uses, and industrial uses. Then we'll look at some examples of each one of those. Probably the most widely known genetic engineered trait is herbicide resistance, and there are several herbicide resistant traits that are either available or are in the pipeline to be commercialized pretty soon. But the one that's most famous and most people would know about would be glyphosate resistant, or Roundup Ready. Some of the benefits that we have seen from herbicide resistant traits is an increase in reduced tillage or no-till. So as we decrease that tillage, what we see is less soil erosion, more CO2 sequestration. And you see on the bottom left there that in a conventional field on the left, basically you have the plants in the field are taking up CO2 for photosynthesis, incorporating in the plant, and the plant's decaying, and you have really a no net gain of CO2 into the soil. And so you've got sort of an equilibrium there. And in no-till, what we're trying to do is build organic matter, and you can see that area where the CO2 is going into the soil is larger than what's coming out. So that's what we're trying to do with no-till, is increase organic matter. Now there's several reasons that it's beneficial to do that. One is increased organic matter improves the water holding capacity of the soil and helps crops do better through dry periods or through droughts. It would increase the amount of soil the amount of CO2 that's not available in the atmosphere for potential greenhouse effects. And one of the things that we've seen with no-till or reduced till systems is that we reduce the number of trips to the field, so we're using less petroleum. Farmers can get by with smaller equipment when they're not doing a lot of tillage operations. So, and that in turn reduces petroleum use. So those are certainly pluses for the environment. And in a huge plus is the reduction in erosion. As long as we can keep a cover out there by reducing tillage, we're going to keep the soil where it needs to be and keep it from running off into the streams. So I borrowed this concept on the bottom right from Kevin Volta. I was watching his talk, and he had slides that were very similar to mine, but he had this little diagram on the bottom right that indicates who benefits from these technologies. And certainly a farmer benefits from reducing his trips through the field and using less fuel, and he benefits by maintaining his topsoil. But that's also a plus for the environment. The environment benefits from less CO2 evolution, less fuel use, and less erosion. Now, one of the concerns that we hear about with herbicide-resistant traits is weed resistance, and you've probably heard it referred to in the media as superweeds. Now, superweeds is a new term. I never heard of that term until we had genetically engineered crops, but weed resistance is not new to agriculture. Weed resistance has been around for ever since we started using herbicides. I think it's important to point out here, especially to a non-farming audience, a lot of times they think pesticides only refers to insecticides, but pesticides is a broad term that includes a lot of things. It includes herbicides, insecticides, miticides, fungicides, nematicides, and here we're talking about herbicides, which is a type of pesticide. If you look at the bottom left, you can see that we have labeled 4 different types of herbicides: ALS inhibitors, triazines, ACC-ACE inhibitors, and glycines. And you can see that ALS inhibitors, we have the most species that are resistant to ALS inhibitors. And that has nothing to do with genetic engineering. The glycines on the bottom would include glyphosate. And you can see in the mid-90s that number started to increase. And that's when we started using genetically engineered crops, is in the mid-90s. But still, we don't have as many resistant species as we do to several of these other types of herbicides or classes of herbicides. Now on the right, we have another herbicide resistant or weed resistant system, and this was created using mutation breeding. It has nothing to do with genetic engineering, and it's used in these. There's both corn and rice that are available in these systems, and these plants are resistant to the imidazolinones. That's a class of herbicides. We don't hear about that in the press. Nobody seems too concerned, although that chemistry is probably more likely to have problems with weed resistance than the glycines from what we've seen in the past. Another concern that we see with weed resistance, and this could be a concern for any of the traits, but since weed resistance is the first trait we're discussing, I'll go ahead and talk about gene flow to closely related species. Now that would be particularly a concern in the areas where the center of origin of a particular crop is. For example, if you look at peanuts down in South America, that's the center origin of peanuts, so you'd have many, you'd have more closely related plants to peanuts that could potentially cross-pollinate with a genetically engineered peanut. So that's certainly a concern that a lot of people have, and in fact, corn is not allowed in Mexico, and that's one of the primary reasons, because that's the center of origin of corn, and there are wild relatives and ancestors of corn in that area. So here we've seen we had a paper on gene flow from glyphosate-resistant canola to some wild mustards or brassicas. And in this study, they saw that it did happen at low levels, but there was some horizontal gene flow. And in this study, they found that the crosses were, the resulting crosses were less fit and were not as likely to cause any major ecological concerns. But that certainly might not always be the case. But this is one of the things that scientists look at. They look at the fitness, look at the likelihood this might happen. Certainly with canola, there are a lot of closely related species, so we knew that the likelihood of that happening with canola was higher than probably most crops. And but we look at the resulting crosses to see what is the risk. Are the crosses going to be more fit? Are they going to be able to have an ecological advantage where they might proliferate? And in this case, they actually found that that there was some fitness penalty associated with these crosses. But that's certainly a concern that some people have. Certainly, this could happen. We're going to talk in a minute about Bt crops, insect resistance, or nutritionally enhanced crops, and those could happen. Gene flow to closely related species could happen with those. So I think it's probably a matter of looking at the risk. It's doubtful that increased nutrition would incur a lot of ecological risk in terms of fitness of the resulting crosses, whereas you could argue that maybe Bt might. Now there is some technology that exists that could help mitigate this, and these are called GERTs, which is gene usage restriction technologies, and you've probably heard them called terminator seeds. So that kind of technology could be used to stop gene flow or prevent gene flow, but that probably won't happen because the technology has been there's a lot of people afraid of the technology might keep people in Africa from saving their seeds, and the companies have said that they're not interested in pursuing this kind of technology at the time. Now the technology exists, it's just not commercialized. So if you hear somebody talking about Monsanto or whoever is using terminator seeds, that's not true. The technology exists, but it has not been commercialized, and they are indicating they have no plans to commercialize it. But it could be a way to prevent gene flow. Another concern that you hear about is increased herbicide usage, and here I have a quote from Gary Hirschberg, who's the chairman of the Just Label It campaign, and he's also the chairman of Stonyfield, an organic yogurt company. And he says, despite assurances to Congress and regulators over the last 2 decades that modified crops modified to be herbicide resistant would lead to less chemical usage, that has not been the case. And certainly this chart on the right is a chart that came from Food and Water Watch. And if you look at the total pesticide usage over that period, it did increase. And that's where I think Mr. Hirschberg got his figure of 527 million pounds over that period. But that chart doesn't tell all the story. That increase in total usage does not account for any changes in acreage. So when we look at that chart, and there it is again on the left, and you compare it to the actual pounds used per acre for the same crops, you can see there's been relatively little change over this period. And the years you see there in white were years that there's no data for. You can see very little change in the amount per acre. So what happened there is acreage increased, and that resulted in a total increase, but the per acre use not necessarily so. And in fact, if we break it down and look a little more closely, if you look at At corn on the left, you can see that the total herbicides went down. Glyphosate did increase. And on the right, you look at the total herbicides used in soybeans during this period, went up some, and that was primarily an increase in glyphosate and a decrease in other herbicides. Now, certainly glyphosate has a lower toxicity than most of the herbicides that it replaced. So many people would say that even with an increase in herbicide, that's an environmental win in terms of pesticide and toxicity in the environment. Some of the other concerns you hear about, and this is most recently as referring to Roundup resistant, is the World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer announced that it was classifying glyphosate as probably carcinogenic to humans. That goes, some other things that are in that category include night shifts, wood smoke, and of course glyphosate. Some known carcinogens are, which is a higher level of concern, include sunshine, ethanol and alcoholic beverages, and acrylamide, which we'll talk a little bit about later when we talk about potatoes. I think it's important to keep in mind that this group from the WHO did not conduct any additional research. They reviewed some research, and it's primarily survey research where they surveyed applicators. So, and one of the members of the committee said this had little bearing on the consumer, and more so potentially on applicators. Now, I think it's also important to realize that that's only one group within WHO, or the World Health Organization. 3 other groups within WHO have agreed that glyphosate is safe and not a carcinogen. And our major agencies around the world, most of them have agreed that glyphosate is not carcinogenic. And here you have one of the WHO organizations, also an Australian organization, our EPA in the United States, and the German Risk Agency, which is similar to the EPA, have all found that there was no evidence that glyphosate caused cancer, which is what carcinogenic means. Another concern we've been hearing about lately is 2,4-D toxicity. And like that, the sign there says stop Monsanto and Dow's new toxic GMO chemical cocktail. Keep Agent Orange, soy, and corn off your plate. I think it's important to understand exactly what's going on here. Agent Orange, which was used in Vietnam as a defoliant, was a mixture of herbicides, and it contained 2,4-D and another herbicide called 2,4,5-T. Well, the problem was the 2,4,5-T was contaminated with dioxin. It was not the 2,4-D that caused the problem. 2,4-D has been used for many years since then, particularly in pastures and in turf, and to include home yards. Now we'll move on to insect resistance. So for most of you, this would, the most common is Bt. You probably heard of Bt corn or Bt cotton. And this is insecticide use in corn. You can see that we saw a decrease in insecticide use with insect-resistant corn. Certainly the farmers benefit from using less pesticides, and the environment benefits as well. There's also insect resistance in some other crops, and this is Bt brinjal, which is is not approved in the United States, but it has been approved in Bangladesh and is currently under consideration in a couple other developing countries. And eggplant is what brinjal is, and it requires a lot of insecticide sprays to prevent what you see on the bottom left from insect damage. So certainly here they've reduced the amount of insecticide sprays, and that is a benefit to the farmers, the environment, in this case to the needy, because it's an important crop in some developing countries. And here we see the decrease in insecticide applications. The amount of insecticides used has decreased as the dotted line there, as corn acreage has shifted to BT corn. And the same thing on the bottom for cotton. As we've shifted more BT cotton, the amount of insecticides we've used in cotton has decreased. Okay, improved nutrition is another group of traits that we currently see a lot of activity in biotechnology. And on the top left, you see golden rice. On the top right, you see high omega soybeans or canola and flax. I think this one's particularly interesting because not only is that improved human nutrition, but it also, they're looking at this to feed salmon farming, because salmon don't make their own omega-3s, so it's important that they have it in their diet. And currently this is done by feeding bait fish or small fish to the salmon to provide omega-3 to their diet. So what they're doing now is looking to replace that fish in their diet, in the salmon diet, in the salmon farming, to still maintain salmon farming with high omega-3. So this would reduce or eliminate the need to use catch feeder fish, which I think you can imagine is disruptive environmentally. On the bottom left, see that golden rice, which is on the top left, it has increased beta carotene, which is what humans need to make vitamin A. And about 500,000 people go blind every year due to vitamin A deficiency in developing countries. And about half of those die within a year from other complications due to vitamin A deficiency. So certainly that would be a plus for developing countries. There's a purple tomato that was genetically engineered to have high anthocyanin levels, and that is important because it's high in antioxidants. The anthocyanin is an antioxidant. So the article there talks about it as maybe a way to prevent cancer or help prevent cancer. So the golden rice is close to being available. There's still a lot of non-governmental organizations that are fighting its acceptance in developing countries, but it's close to being available if it gets through the regulatory system. The soybeans are available now, and they also have the high omega-3 canola. And the purple tomato was developed in a public lab, and it's probably a while for that's available because the cost of registration for these products is really high. So it'll be difficult for a small public lab to foot the bill for that. We often hear about that GMOs could cause allergens, but one of the things they're looking at in using biotechnology is to reduce allergens. So probably, you can traditional breeding can cause allergens, and we've seen that. One of the best examples is some commercially bred or traditionally bred celeries. When we're breeding with genetic engineering, you know what DNA you're putting in the plant or what gene you're putting in there, and you know what protein it codes for. So you have a good idea, and you can test that protein to see if it has allergen, if it could cause allergens. And the technology is also being used to take chemicals out of the plant or genes out of the plant that produce allergens that bother people. Disease resistance is another group of traits. Certainly, disease resistance would benefit the farmer, would benefit the environment because of reduced fungicide sprays, and in some cases, particularly with viruses, you're reducing insect sprays because viruses are often spread by insects. So the main method of control is by controlling insects to prevent their spread. And that could certainly help the needy because several of these crops are used in needy parts of the world. So papaya on the left, top left, the papaya industry in Hawaii was almost wiped out by a virus called papaya ring spot virus. And this was one of the first commercially available genetically engineered crops. And it's probably saved the papaya industry in the United States. And this is an example where insecticide sprays are not needed to control insects that vector the virus. In the top left is grapes that are resistant to Pierce's disease. On the top right are virus-resistant genetically engineered beans. And these were developed by a Brazilian Public Agricultural Research Corporation, linked to the Ministry of Agriculture in Brazil. In the bottom left, we have a blight-resistant potato. And the blight is the same thing that caused the Irish potato famine, and it's still a problem. It's still estimated to cause 20% reduction in yields worldwide. And you can see there in the center there, the number of sprays that are involved on the left part of that image. You see the number of sprays that are used in conventionally produced potatoes. And on the right, if you can control the blight or the Phytophthora, you could eliminate the majority of those sprays. You see a couple remaining sprays there. I think that those are primarily either for Alternaria or Fusarium. So certainly that could benefit the needy and benefit the environment with reduced pesticide sprays. Citrus greening, you may or may not have heard about this. This is a big problem in Florida, to the point that it's possible that the citrus industry could collapse in Florida. They've lost over 100,000 trees since 2005, and the state's lost about almost $4 billion since 2007. And then the disease has shown up in California now. So they're looking at genetic engineering as a possibility to control this disease. And one of the more interesting ones is involving a gene from spinach. And certainly farmers, the environment, and the needy would benefit from having orange juice and citrus available in their diet. This is a chestnut tree, and if you look there on the top right, you see the people in the background. You get an idea how big chestnut trees used to be and how wide their range was. And in fact, they used to be called the Eastern redwood. They were huge trees, sequester a lot of carbon, but they were almost made extinct. There are few trees left, and researchers have been working, and they particularly worked with a gene out of wheat. They moved from wheat to confer resistance to the chestnut blight. So that's certainly interesting, and would certainly be beneficial to the environment to have chestnut trees back. Here we have several examples of stress tolerance type traits. On the top left you have salt resistant rice, and next to that you have some flood resistant rice. We'll look at that in a little more detail in a minute. And then some aluminum on the top right, some aluminum tolerant corn, which could be a huge benefit to many areas of the world, the tropics, where you have acidic soils and aluminum toxicity, which is certainly even a problem in the southeast and in North Carolina on a lot of soils. And on the bottom you have crops that might be able to resist drought, and that could become even more important with climate change. So certainly those type traits could benefit farmers, and especially the needy in countries that are dealing with the effects of climate change and have limited technology to deal with that. And Pamela Ronald is one of the more famous people involved in stress tolerance. She developed a rice, flood-resistant rice. I think one of the things that's sort of interesting, she wrote a book with her husband called Tomorrow's Table, and he's an organic farmer. And one of the things that I found really interesting is that one of the things about flooding rice, one of the reasons for flooding it is to control weeds. So if you could flood it for a longer period of time, that would be not only a benefit to areas like Bangladesh that maybe have floods that they can't control, but to organic farmers in the United States, because they could have a longer period of weed control using flooding, as opposed to very limited tools that are available to control weeds in organic production. I lumped these two together as increased storage. On the top left you have an Arctic apple. Three apples on the top are Arctic, and the 3 apples on the bottom are conventional. And what they've done is they've engineered these crops, and there's no genes moved from another species. This is really silencing a gene within apples to reduce the particular enzyme's activity, so that the apples don't brown. And the guy, Neil Carter, is the chairman of the company that developed this, and he's a farmer in Canada with a very small company, less than 10 people in the company, and he's a really interesting guy. He tells a story that he was watching how carrots, particularly when the little small baby carrots came out, how carrot consumption was going up, and apple consumption was going down. And some of the research that the Apple folks did showed that kids particularly, and somewhat grown-ups, are not likely to pick up a whole apple when you're having snacks. They want to pick up something smaller, like a grape or a small carrot. and they're also not likely to pick up an apple that's browned. So that's where he came up with this idea to try to increase apple consumption. So certainly that would be a benefit to the apple farmers and to consumers. Now on the bottom left, this is what's called innate potatoes, and these potatoes are engineered similarly so that they don't bruise and they don't turn brown, or they don't bruise as easily. And the company that developed this is also has in the pipeline for the near future to have this trait also included with the blight resistance for potatoes. This is an example of a medicinal use, and certainly there have been crops that have been used to produce medicines using genetic engineering. This one's sort of interesting because it's developed for the developing world, so it would benefit the needy. And what they did is the plant produces a small part of the cholera toxin, so that when children eat it, they become vaccinated against cholera. Industrial uses. Inogen corn was developed by Syngenta, and it contains a gene that allows it to produce alpha amylase. So that helps break down cornstarch into sugar, and that means you have to use less energy and water in processing the corn for ethanol. So there's a lot of environmental savings, as you see there, in terms of water, electricity, and natural gas, and reducing carbon dioxide emissions. And the examples there are for 100 million gallon tank a year, plant a year. On the top right is trees that have been genetically modified so that the lignin breaks down easier, so that there's not as much energy used to break down the lignin for the paper industry. So certainly that would be a plus for the environment and gives farmers another option. This was an interesting study about who benefits the most from crop biotech or GMOs, developing countries or developed countries. And you can see that each it's broken down by different traits for developed countries and different traits for developing countries. But when you look at the cumulative for developed versus developing, it's circled in red there, you see a bigger difference in yield for developing countries. And a lot of this is because the developing countries don't have other options for pest control. So while it's true that the United States and Europe could probably get by and feed themselves very well without biotechnology, at least right now, we might lose oranges or something like that, but we certainly could feed ourselves. Developing countries get more benefit from this technology. And there was a pretty good study, particularly on insect-resistant cotton in India, where they showed that not only was this difference in yield, it was a difference in income for those farmers. One of the things I think that we don't think about when we talk about who benefits from the technology is it's certainly beneficial to a farmer in the United States to not have to apply as many pesticides. But a farmer in the United States has access to very good equipment and protective gear to be as safe as possible on applying pesticides, whereas farmers in developing countries most of the time do not have access to that type of equipment, as you see in several of these pictures. So anything we could do to reduce pesticide use in developing countries is certainly a plus for safety in developing countries. So the related question that came in about why are all GMO traits aimed at increasing production rather than adding nutrition, adding value to nutrition or foods or other health benefits? I think we've talked about several here that provide other benefits. You got the Arctic apple on top left, the golden rice on the top middle, and the cholera vaccine potatoes on the top right. In the middle there you have the innate potatoes. The bottom left you have the high antioxidant purple tomatoes. You have the high omega-3 or improved fatty acid profile soybeans in the top bottom, and then on the bottom right, we're talking about reduced allergen in peanuts. So there are a lot of traits, and certainly the ones that got adapted most quickly and on the most acreage were ones that dealt with huge crops: corn, soybeans, cotton. And I think primarily one of the reasons this second generation of traits has lagged behind a little bit is that companies are struggling through the regulatory process because it's very expensive to bring these things to the market. In the case of golden rice, the patents that Syngenta and Monsanto and other companies held that would be involved in this technology for golden rice, they waived that for any farmer that makes less than $10,000 a year. So it still has to get through the regulatory system, even if you get through the patent system involved. So that has reduced the speed at which some of these products come out. The Arctic apple and the innate potato are now approved and hopefully will soon be available commercially. And the last related question is, are GMO foods necessarily more healthy? Certainly the preponderance of the scientific evidence is that they're materially they're the same, unless they're actually bred, like in the case of golden rice, to have some nutritive difference. One of the things that you probably should be aware of is that vitamins, there's a lot of biotechnology used in vitamin production, particularly in certain vitamins. And if you look at this label, if you look at the picture on the right, you see on the bottom left of that Great Plains protein cinnamon and hazelnut cereal a non-GMO certified sticker. So that's been certified not to have any GMO components. So if you look at the nutrition facts or the labeling for this same cereal, it's on the left. It's the box on the left and the picture in the left, and the box on the right is the non-GMO. And you can see that several of the vitamin levels in the non-GMO are either 0 or lower, and that's because biotechnology is used in a lot in the vitamin industry. So there are cases where you might argue that GMO foods might even be more healthy, but I think what it really points to is you need to look at each thing on a case-by-case basis and not just try to paint things with a broad brush or cast aspersions widely. So thank you.